Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining us. This is a part of our Conservation and Action webinar series that the trustees host every year. I'm Cynthia Dittbrenner, the Director of Coast and Natural Resources for the trustees. I want to thank you for joining us. This webinar provides us an opportunity to take an in-depth look at a lot of our projects across the state and our properties and how we care for our special places. We have over 120 properties now, brought a few new ones on this year, and they are all very unique with very unique histories. And so we have just an amazing team of curators and stewards and ecologists and many more bringing all of these properties to life for you. Today, we're going to talk about our state of the coast work and specifically impacts of sea level rise and storm surge on our beaches and coastal banks. But before we do that, I want to thank all of our donors and members out there. Without you, this work would not be possible. We have gone very virtual this last year, as many of you probably experienced, or I guess more than a year at this point. And so we've created more of these webinar and virtual experiences to keep people engaged. But we've also just seen a huge increase in people visiting our properties. We had over 2 million visitors last year. And so I want to thank our amazing team of people that have been working to keep those properties open and safe for everyone to access. And I hope that this webinar might inspire you to go check out some of our reservations, particularly our coast properties, maybe some of those iconic beaches out on Nantucket or Martha's Vineyard. Thank you for supporting our mission, which is to protect and share the places that people love. So today we have 3 speakers. I will start things off, followed by Tara Marden, who's our senior coastal ecologist with the Wasteway group. And she's going to talk about ways that we can make beaches more resilient to the impacts of sea level rise and storm surge. Shea is our coastal ecologist here at the trustees, and she's going to talk about the significance of our coast and our coastal habitat and then the threats to that. So a few housekeeping things. If you hover, can you go to the next slide, Christine, or do we have that? Oh, there we go. So down at the bottom, you'll see a Q&A button. Please type your questions in there throughout. We're going to stop after each speaker and then we'll answer questions before we move to the next. And then if you would like to enable closed captions, you can click on the button to the right of it, live transcript, and then click on show subtitles. Next. All right, so I'm passing it off to myself now as the first speaker. Again, Cynthia Dittbrenner, Director of Coast and Natural Resources. I joined the trustees fairly recently last summer, very excited to be here after a 20-some-year career in natural resources. Very excited to turn my focus now to resilience of our coastline. I have worked a lot in rivers, river restoration, agricultural resilience, climate change impacts. And so this is just a nice extension of that in a different part of the world for me. So our team of ecologists, which Shea is part of, who's speaking later, we are charged with the care of the ecology and natural resources at all of our reservations across the state. And so we manage grasslands, forests, barrens, salt marshes, all of the beautiful places that you've hopefully visited. Next. So before I talk about the results of our State of the Coast report, I want to just take a quick step back and talk about our coastal strategy. We own or manage over 120 miles of coastline across the state, and we're the largest private landowner of coast. About 5 years ago, we were noticing a lot of changes, erosion, loss of beach, inundation of salt marshes, and so we hired the Woods Hole Group to do a coastal vulnerability assessment just of our properties. And the results were very illuminating, and it prompted us to launch a larger coastal effort called the Coastal Strategy. There's 3 tenets as part of that. The first is to protect our coastline and to advocate for its protection. We also wanted to inspire a love of coast and have it launched several programs to engage the community in our coastal habitats. And then the third is to focus on our most vulnerable places and potentially do interventions there. Next. Part of that coastal strategy is our State of the Coast report. So this is an annual report that we've done 2 of now. In 2020, we launched the State of the Coast for the North Shore, which was our first one. And then this last summer, we launched this report, which was for the islands, Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, and Gosnold. So this is the one I'm going to be talking about today. We are starting a new report for this next year that will be launched next summer, focused on the South Coast and the Buzzards Bay and Narragansett Bay. Next. What we're facing, if you joined us last, or maybe it was 2 weeks ago, for the first in this State of the Coast series, I talked about flooding in our communities and our developed coastline. Today is focused on beaches, but you'll recognize this slide, so bear with me as I walk through it really quickly again. The report looked at the impacts of sea level rise and storms on our coast. And this left graph talks about sea level rise. The green line shows historic sea level rise, and then the 4 dotted lines that diverge from there show different sea level rise scenarios based on how much greenhouse gases we emit. These are different emission scenarios. To simplify, I'll just say that we used the high scenario, which is the dotted orange line, which was the recommendation of the state. So that shows that in 2050, we expect to see rises in seas of about 2.6 feet. By 2070, that's at 4.5. In 2100, it's just over 8 feet. Now, the graph to the right shows flooding. So flood surge levels, the light orange is a 1 in 10-year storm, which is a storm that happens about every 10 years. And then the dark orange is a 100-year storm. So of note is that the 1 in 10-year storm, the 1 in 100-year storm now is projected to be a 1 in 10-year storm into the future. So that just means a storm that we would expect to see once in our lifetime is going to be happening much more frequently in the future. So what does this mean? Next. Well, as you can imagine, these impacts will have result in some changes to our coastline. This is a picture of Long Point out on Martha's Vineyard. We have on Martha's Vineyard, the Elizabeth Islands and Nantucket, we have a total of about 200 miles of beaches and dunes. This map to the right shows you those areas that we incorporated into this report. Obviously, Nantucket is further east, but that shows you the coastline. Go ahead and hit the next one. There we go. And you can click on the text, Christine, thank you. So beaches and banks erode. One of the main pieces of information we looked at for this report is erosion rates in erosion areas where there's a big threat. On Martha's Vineyard, we have lost more than 1,400 acres in the last 130 years. And on Nantucket, it's been 1,900 acres. Now, what we're noticing is that those rates are increasing faster now. This is a picture of Wasteway Beach on Martha's Vineyard, and it's receded 1,500 feet in the last 130 years, which is equivalent to about 5 city blocks. Next. Here's a picture just north of Edgartown on Martha's Vineyard. You can see the dotted lines show the historic shoreline. So the red is where the shoreline was in the 1890s. We had this nice barrier beach coming across here, protecting this area, which is why it's called Eel Pond, because at one point it was more like a pond. And then you'll notice that after that, the beach breached. And now this pink area shows areas of projected erosion out to 2050. That's from FEMA. So because that barrier beach isn't there, we are expecting to see more threats to our coast. 3,000 acres of beachfront at risk of eroding across all of the islands. And then the threat is about 4.6 billion in land value, but that we weren't able to include the value of the structure, so it's probably much higher. Next. This is a similar map on Nantucket and Nantucket out to 2050. Again, this pink area shows projected beach erosion. So you can see in the very lower left corner, that dotted red line was the historic shoreline in 1887. So it eroded almost 1,500 feet as well in the last 130 years. Next. Beaches migrate. We looked at historic locations of beaches, and this is Norton Point Beach. I love this graphic because it just shows the nature of sand, right? It's very unconsolidated, dynamic, it moves. This is a barrier beach that's 2.5 miles long. It's projected to potentially be open ocean by 2070 because of sea level rise. It's migrated more than 1,500 feet north, but you can also see that it breaches and then it reattaches and then it breaches and then it reattaches. So it's just a very dynamic system, which is natural, but we're seeing it happen at a much more frequent rate, the erosion in the past years. Next. Oh, actually, can you go back one? So if you were at the very left side of this map in a drone, kind of looking west across the barrier beach, that's what this next slide is. So go ahead and click next. So this is looking out along that barrier beach, and it shows a project we just did here in the foreground. All of that light colored sand is 11,000 cubic yards of sand we just put there to restore the dune. And Tara is going to talk more about that. So I will save that for later. Next. So beaches also flood. If you joined me a few weeks ago, you probably saw this map on the left. We looked at the flood projections out into the future from what's called the MCFRM model that Woods Hole Group did for the state. And then we overlaid that, well, actually, Woods Hole Group overlaid that with infrastructure data. So the map to the left shows buildings and roads that are expected to flood into the future in 2050. But what I wanted to show you is this graph on the right, which is the Cascada Coatue Wildlife Refuge out on Nantucket. The red shows areas of erosion and the blue is areas of accretion where sand is building up. So we look at the balance between that. But then if you take the flooding data and the sea level rise and the flooding data and you overlay that onto these erosion rates, then it starts to tell a really interesting picture. And there are a few places that we're concerned about breaches. And so Tara, again, is going to talk more about that. Next. I want to announce that we are launching today a new panorama tour that we just created. It's the Cascada Coatue Wildlife Refuge Panorama Tour. You can access it on the trustees.org/360. So what this is it gives you a bird's eye view. It was created by a drone. You get to fly over the wildlife refuge and see all the habitat and the beaches, and it's very interesting. And then at these different points that you'll see in green, you can click on it and you hear from staff telling you about what's going on at that point in the at the beach. And I just do want to thank our funders, which was Remain Nantucket Pilot House Foundation, and then the Nantucket Conservation Foundation for helping put this together. And actually NCF, Nantucket Conservation Foundation, is a partner in this. You'll see their logo there. So we're both helping create this because we co-manage this wildlife refuge together. Next. If you would like to access this information online, you can go to the trustees.org/coast. You'll see that site in the upper left-hand corner. You'll see something like this. You click on maps, then you can access the projected flooding by clicking on that tab. And then the erosion and the previous shoreline locations are on that FEMA coastal erosion tab. And if you go next, you end up on this online map that looks something like this, where you can zoom in to your property or to your town and then click on and off the projections to the left. So I encourage you to check that out. Next. So what do we do? That's what Tara's going to tell you all about. But there's many different things we can do to adapt or become resilient. We tend to bin them in these 4 categories here. So protection. One thing we surely can do is protect our natural areas along the coast, because they provide protection against storm surge. Also, protection includes things like bank stabilization projects or seawalls, although we would always encourage more nature-based solutions. The second is adaptive designs, so we can adapt to the way we build, the way we develop. We can adapt our existing structures, raise things, raise buildings, raise roads. The Edgartown Yacht Club in 2019 was raised 2 feet. Although that can be quite costly, I believe that project cost over $7 million. We can restore things. I just showed you that Norton Point beach that both speakers will talk a little bit more about. Restore dunes, restore habitat. We've got a huge initiative to restore salt marsh across our properties. And then the fourth is retreat and relocation. Our communities, we like to be near water. I mean, I am guilty of that as well. I can look out at the beach through my window right now. I love the ocean. We have homes on the beaches, we have our communities, we have harbors, we have ports. Our beach areas are very important to us. And so we need to think strategically about when do we protect and adapt? And then when is that not a viable long-term solution and we need to retreat and relocate? So I do want to give a huge shout out to Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard entities on both that are working really hard through collaborative process to engage the public and each other in figuring out how do we make our islands more resilient into the future. And with that, I would like to thank our sponsors, Remain Nantucket and Breckenridge Capital Advisors, who supported this report for the islands. And then the next slide provides my contact information if you have questions or want to get in touch with me. So thank you very much. I will pass it to Tara, who's next, but I think first, do we have time for questions?
Yes, if anyone has any questions specifically for Cynthia right now, you can please use the Q&A box and just chat us a question. If not, feel free to save your question for the end and we'll have another opportunity at that point to go through those questions. We do have one question, Cynthia, so far. What happened to our beaches in the storm this last weekend, that nor'easter we experienced?
Yeah, you know, we expected to see more impacts. We definitely had flooding out on Nantucket. There was overwash at the Gulls, which is that beach that leads out to the Great Point Lighthouse. And then that Great Point Pond out there filled up pretty significantly and is causing some issues with access and the trails. That's all was expected. There was quite a lot of erosion along Cascada Beach on the east side. But then on Martha's Vineyard, we didn't see a lot of erosion at our project sites. The Norton project that we just put all that brand new sand out there, we were really worried about a bunch of it washing away, but went out there and looked at it and it looks like it's still intact. And part of that may be because we had really nice icy snow covering everything and protecting it. So yeah, we had a lot of flooding, but we didn't see huge impacts to erosion.
Great. And Cynthia, what are the next steps for some of these potential breach and erosion sites?
That is a great segue into Tara's talk. We have commissioned Woods Hole Group to do design and assessment reports for both Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket. Both of them are now complete, and they look at vulnerable places on our properties specifically to erosion and breaching, and provide some recommendations for ways we can move forward. So we are using those reports, we're using those reports to work with our partners to determine next steps, because so many of those beaches are co-managed. So on Nantucket, for example, the Nantucket Conservation Foundation and us partnered together to have Woods Hole Group complete that report for the wildlife refuge. So now we're working together with Woods Hole Group and Boston University researchers and thinking about, okay, what are the priority sites and what types of projects might we implement? Where does it make sense to implement a project, and where might it make sense to just do managed retreat or let nature take its course? So we will be engaging the public in a lot of those discussions in the coming months, and I would invite you to participate.
Great, thank you. So I guess we're going to move to Tara next. And like I said, there should be some time at the end for additional questions for Cynthia if we did not get to everyone.
Great, so Tara, go ahead and introduce yourself. I'll just say she's the Senior Coastal Ecologist at Woods Hole Group.
Hi there, everybody. My name is Tara Marden, and I am a senior coastal geologist at the Woods Hole Group. I've been at the Woods Hole Group for the past 23 years, but I've been studying coastal systems up and down the east coast of the US for about 30 years. Majority of my work with the Woods Hole Group for the past 23 years has been on the island. So I'm very, very familiar with the beaches and the processes there. About 4 years ago, I was fortunate enough to get involved with the project with the trustees, looking at sites on the vineyard, mostly in Edgartown. And the purpose of that study was to actually evaluate climate change vulnerabilities at 6 different sites, mostly in Edgartown, one at Long Point, and determine what the vulnerabilities were. And then based on that overall project, pick 3 sites that we would further the investigation for, come up with conceptual designs for some green infrastructure projects, and then pick 1 project to actually permit and construct, which happened this winter. So I'm going to describe some of the sites for you and share a little bit of the analysis that we did, and then share some photographs and some details about the resiliency project that we are, that is in the works right now. Next slide. Okay, so in order to understand what the climate change vulnerabilities on the island were, we used a whole suite of different data sets. We use shoreline change analysis. We use the SLAM model to look at marsh migration. We use the MCFRM, which is a flooding inundation model that Woods Hole Group created, and we had some sites specific to the vineyard. We did site studies, we went out and we evaluated each of the sites on the ground. We considered what type of alternatives potentially could be used at each of these sites. And then we created conceptual design for 3 of the sites. And as I said before, that we designed and permitted one of those sites, which happened today. So this slide just kind of shows you some of the data sets that actually went into the analysis that we did. Next slide. And the sites that we looked at, we did look at Long Point, which is further to the west than Edgartown, but that site was not really part of the evaluation. So these were the sites in Edgartown that we looked at: Cape Pogue, the Wildlife Refuge, Leland Beach, which is on the far eastern coast of Chappaquiddick, Wasteway, which Cynthia showed some pictures of earlier, Norton Point East, which is the long skinny barrier beach that has the inlet that breaks through there about every 30 years and migrates to the east, and then Norton Point West. So these were the sites that we evaluated. And then from the initial evaluation, which included the site visit, we chose Wasteway, Norton Point Beach East, and Norton Point Beach West, where the oversand vehicle trail access is, as the sites that we were going to study as part of the analysis. Next slide. So Wasteway was the first site that we looked at. If you've ever been here before, you know that it's beautiful. It's very natural. It's almost a little bit wild when you go out there. It's almost like taking a step back in time because it's really, truly been untouched by humans. There are some walking trails there. There are picnic tables and like some dirt parking areas, but the shoreline itself is extremely natural and it's really beautiful. It's also really unique in the fact that there are really steep eroding bluffs here. But then there's also this really dynamic, like thin ribbon of sand barrier beach seaward of those eroding bluffs. And that configuration has occurred because the bluffs are like a headland at the lower end of Chappaquiddick, but that Norton Point, where we have seen a couple of times now with that long, thin barrier beach at the bottom of Katama Bay, that as the inlet breaks through there and migrates to the east, this giant slug of sand, which is this barrier beach here that you see in the bottom lower photograph, it migrates along the shoreline and it eventually welds onto Wasteway. So this is a really unique site in that you have these big, beautiful bluffs, but then you have also this protective barrier beach on the seaward side. This site here has some of the highest erosion rates in the state. Erosion has been pretty dramatic over the past, several decades. And this is concerning for the trustees because this site has public access. It's really, really heavily used in the summertime because it provides public access. There is parking, there's walking trails, and there's access to this beautiful remote beach. So this was one of the sites that we evaluated, and we did come up with some green infrastructure solutions for this. Next slide. So keeping in line with the trustees' mission, we really didn't consider anything here that was a hard solution. There's not really anything here to protect other than nature and wildlife and land. And so we looked at solutions that were soft stabilization type solutions, beach nourishment, vegetation management, patron management, where we would manage the location of the trails and the parking areas, a managed retreat where, those patron uses would actually, like the trails and all that, would be moved landward as the shoreline continued to retreat. But we did actually look at one soft solution for the coastal bank here, which would have been like a 5-roll array with some beach nourishment and some grass plantings on top. So we looked at a whole suite of alternatives here. We have not implemented anything on this site, but this is a potential site for a pilot study in the future. And I think that the trustees will come back to this site when we finish the project that we're working on at the OSV. Next slide. So this is Norton Point Barrier Beach. This is probably the most dynamic barrier beach system in the state. I mean, maybe one of the most dynamic barrier beach systems on the East Coast. It's extremely important because Norton Point actually provides the only driving access to Chappaquiddick Island. It's also one of the few beaches or the few places where vehicle access is allowed on the beach. So you can actually get a visitor pass to come out here and actually go to the beach for the day in your vehicle, which, as most of us know, you can't do that most places in Massachusetts. Like I said, it's probably one of the most dynamic in the state. And that's because of the fact that this area is typically breached about every 30-ish years in a tidal inlet forms. And that tidal inlet actually can get pretty big, like 1,500 feet across. And that tidal inlet migrates to the east. And so when the inlet is there, the access along the barrier beach to Chappaquiddick is cut off. The last time the breach opened, it was opened between 2007 and 2015. And then it closed up in 2015. It's been relatively stable since, but I think we all realize that, you know, historically this has breached, and in the future this will breach also. You know, the barrier beach restores itself over time, but it is a really vulnerable area. Next slide. So for that reason, the only alternative that we really considered here in our analysis was sand nourishment to restore dunes in beach grass plantings. The purpose of the dune restoration would be to provide elevation to the barrier beach in areas that are really low and overwash prone, you know, improving the resiliency, making it less vulnerable to storms and inlet breaching. Simply due to the size of the project here, this is a project that would have to have a phased approach. We really don't have the sand resources to go out and do a large scale beach nourishment or dune restoration project here. So this is the type of project that would be done where we would look at the most vulnerable areas and, you know, potentially do a dune restoration or beach grass plantings here to try and stabilize the barrier beach, but not likely to do a large scale project here at any given time. And, you know, beach grass plantings to some of the higher elevations of the dune system here would also be beneficial. So we've looked at these alternatives, but we have not moved forward with any of these. Again, you know, sourcing of the sand would be really challenging here. And the cost would be really expensive. So nothing has happened on this site, but it is a really good site for some future resiliency projects. Next slide. So the third site that we looked at was the Norton Point Beach West is what we call it. And this is where the oversand vehicle access is that comes from the intersection there of Katama Road and Atlantic Ave. This is the intersection where you can actually come through the pathway that you see there along the roadway and out onto the beach. And so over time, the dune here became compromised because of so much vehicle access along the beach. And so a large overwash fan, which you can see in this photograph here, actually formed several years ago. And this became problematic because the dune was really, really low here, but there were also some piping plovers, which are endangered species, that attempted to nest here several years in a row. They were not successful. This is a heavily used area. They were not successful, but it is still considered, you know, a habitat. So when we looked at the site, we had to do the design and the permitting in coordination with Natural Heritage Endangered Species Program to make sure that we were designing a project that was going to not result in a take of the habitat. So this site is interesting because it provides that access. It also generates hundreds of thousands of dollars in revenue each year for oversand vehicle permits. So you have to get a permit to actually come over the beach here. So you know, it generates a lot of money that way. And so this was a project that we decided was probably the most important at the time of the study. And this is the project that we moved forward with. Next slide. So for this site, a number of alternatives were considered. And that included not doing anything here, like just a beach grass program, potentially some sand fence, beach nourishment, dune restoration, and locating the OSV trail. And what we decided is that a combination of these alternatives was probably what was going to work best here. The first thing that we considered was actually relocating the oversand vehicle trail outside of the overwash, putting it on the back side of the dune so that the vehicles were not coming from the roadway through the dune and out onto the beach anymore. So a big part of this was to move that access so that, number one, the access wasn't threatened, but number two, the access wasn't running over the dune, causing continued erosion. Dune restoration was the second part of the project, and that included creating a really wide, big dune, having 10-to-1 slopes on either side, which was difficult to fit into this area, but somehow we managed to do that. And then beach grass plantings, which are part of the permit, but actually haven't been done yet. So we took this project through the permitting phase for the dune design, the beach grass, and the relocation of the OSV trail. And that happened this past year. And at the same time, the town of Edgartown actually owns the area adjacent where the roadway is, and there's actually a bathhouse there. And the town of Edgartown at the same time permitted a resiliency project with the Woodsole Group to remove the asphalt that was closest to the dune and relocate the bathhouse further back and away from the dune, and then included that as part of the dune restoration. So if you go to the next slide. So in the way that we accomplished this is we went through the design and permitting phase. We got the permit for this, and then we worked with the town of Edgartown, Dukes County, and the trustees to actually apply for a coastal zone management resiliency grant. The town and the trustees were awarded that grant this past year. It was a 2021 grant, and we commenced construction in the fall. So this past fall, we started construction. The total project was 11,000 yards. The sand for the project came from a dredging site in Katama Bay. The sand was pumped up onto Norton Point Beach and then actually trucked down the beach to the job site. And the project also included the 30,000 square feet of new plantings and the relocation of the OSV trail. Next slide. So I put these slides in here so you can see a little bit of the construction that took place. Like I said, the sand came from about a half a mile down the beach. It came from a dredging site, which was very cost effective for everybody to have a sand source like right there close to the project site that was compatible with the material here. The sand was trucked down the beach. It was placed in this area. Then the final grading was done just about a couple of weeks ago. If you can see in the bottom right, that's the town project, the bathhouse that was moved back. The two dunes were blended together so that it's one big dune system here. And the beach grass plantings will take place before the end of March. So this is the project that was designed, permitted, construction, and really, really has built up the resiliency of this area. In the OSV trail, which is the top picture on the right, is now on the back side of the dune. So rather than coming from the roadway over the dune onto the beach, you actually come in from the roadway and you go along the back side of the dune. And you go down pretty far, maybe about a quarter of a mile before you have that first access that takes you out onto the beach. Next slide. So I think that the trustees were happy with the work that we did on the Vineyard, and they were interested to know if we could do something similar out on Nantucket. So the Nantucket project is still, it's still in the works right now. We just submitted the final report with recommendations to the trustees in the Nantucket Conservation Foundation, but I'm just gonna basically show you two slides and talk a little bit about this. So for Nantucket, there were 4 areas that we studied. Those included the haulover, which the haulover basically is the access that comes from the mainland part of Nantucket that gets you out onto Cotu Cascada Wildlife Refuge. And then we have a site at Cascada Pond, also up at the Galls. That's the area that Cynthia talked about, which had some overwash during this last storm event. And then all the way to the west, there's an area between First and Second Point that we looked at, a little bit different than the other 3 sites, which were all Atlantic facing beaches on Nantucket. This one is impacted more by the sound and actually the harbor. So we're collaborating with the trustees and the Nantucket Conservation Foundation to come up with similar type solutions here that we did on the Vineyard. We looked at the same type of data sets, the MCFRM, the SLAM model, some shoreline change analysis. We did some future projections, and we came up with some alternatives for this. Mostly included sand nourishment type things, beach grass, but we also looked at more innovative technologies here, looking at oyster bed sills, salt marsh restoration, and a few things that were kind of outside of the scope of the Vineyard project. Innovative technologies, I'll call them. Next slide. And so these are some of the things that we considered. No action, of course, is an option at any site, and you just let nature take its course. Vegetation management, which is a rather simple thing that you can do. It's just managing the vegetation in a certain area. If you've got trees that are falling off the top of the coastal bank, potentially move those. They're removing invasive species. There are things that you can do with vegetation management, removing invasive species so that it doesn't destroy native species like beach grass, which really help to stabilize dune systems. Patron management, where you can move trails back and keep people off the edge of the bluffs and those types of things. Sand fence, which, is pretty good for like short-term sediment accumulation, not really a long-term resiliency concept. Certainly dune nourishment, beach nourishment. Again, out here, the sourcing of sand is really difficult. So we did come up with some nourishment alternatives, but we do understand that logistically those may be challenging to actually implement. And then some more innovative technologies like salt marsh restoration, living breakwater, thin layer sediment placement in the overwash of the galls, managed retreat, and then a combination of efforts. So at this point, this project is more in its infancy than the Vineyard project was, but hopefully, based on the recommendation, there are some projects here that the trustees and the Nantucket Conservation Foundation can sink their teeth into and take on, sometime over the next couple of years to have some projects that, really help to improve the resiliency out here. Next slide. And that's it. So I hope that you enjoyed hearing about these 2 great projects, and I can take questions if we have time, and otherwise my email address is here. You can certainly email me or ask me questions at the end of the presentation.
Great, thank you, Tara. We do have time for a couple questions now, and we will get to more at the end of the next presentation. We'll also follow up over email for any questions we can't get to during our hour here today. And for anyone who may have joined late, you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to ask a question at any point during these presentations. So to start out, Tara, we have a question from John. Isn't the health of Katama Bay somewhat dependent on the periodic opening of the channel at Norton Point?
Hi. So the health of the bay. So, I'm not really exactly sure how to answer that because that's not something we studied, but I can tell you that the shoaling inside of Katama Bay has had somewhat of a negative impact on the shellfish community there now. So as the barrier beach migrates, when the inlet is opened, a lot of sand moves in and out of the bay. I think more sand probably moves into the bay than out of the bay. And as the inlet migrates, that shoal system that's on the inside of the inlet actually migrates down towards Wasteway or Chappaquiddick. You also have a lot of aeolian activity which puts sediment in the bay. And so I've actually been working with the town on this particular project, the town of Edgartown, on a Seaport Economic Grant to actually look at the shoaling that's occurred in the bay and the impacts that it's had to shellfish, because there are a number of shellfish grants in the bay, and the shellfishermen have had to move further and further north into the bay because the bay has gotten so shallow and the water temperatures have gotten so warm because of all the shoaling that it's not adequate for shellfish. So interesting that you asked that. We literally just started a study with the town to look at exactly that and to see if there's anything that can be done within that shoal system that would be more beneficial, or that would help, shellfish production or creation in the bay, that would be better than what's there right now. So, it's that project is really in its infancy, and we're doing that through a Seaport Economic Grant that was issued to the town in the fall.
Great. I think we have time for one more question now, Tara. This one's from Diane. Do the resiliency projects protect against the 100-year storms that become every 10-year storms? And do you do a cost benefit risk analysis when deciding which properties to work on?
We personally did not do a cost risk benefit analysis. And honestly, none of these projects are designed to withstand a 100-year storm event. A 100-year storm event is huge, and we don't see those in New England very often. I mean, we're working on these projects to help build up everyday resiliency of a barrier beach, or a beach system, or a coastal dune. We have real limitations based on like footprints of project, the OSV, because that is considered a habitat. We had to create 10-to-1 slope on the landward and seaward side. So we did look at analyses. I mean, we used X Beach, which is a model that looks like at shoreline erosion, or more specifically dune erosion. And we modeled 1 and 2 year events. And some of these projects are getting impacted just by a 1 or 2 year event. I mean, if you had a 100-year event, this whole area is just going to be completely inundated with waves and storm and flooding and all that. So we have so many other restrictions, like the natural heritage restrictions on the slope, which means if you have to create a 10-to-1 slope of a dune and you only have a certain width of a footprint, then you can only create a dune crest that's a certain height, because you can't have a 20-foot dune crest in 10-to-1 slopes on the landward and seaward side in an area that's only 200 feet across. The other factor that really comes into play is source of sand. I mean, sand is scarce in Massachusetts. We don't have permitted offshore borrow sites to put sand up on the beach. Edgartown is fortunate in the fact that they have a lot of navigation projects where they can, beneficially reuse sand from the navigation projects, but we don't have a real source of sand. I mean, I've worked on projects in Edgartown where we've had to barge from the mainland almost 100,000 yards of sand for a beach nourishment project. So we have limitations that are set forth that we really can't change. And those really come down to habitat restrictions and sand sourcing. I mean, we don't even build coastal structures to withstand a 100-year storm event. I mean, it's really unrealistic.
Thank you, Tara. I'm going to pass the mic now to Shea, who is our coastal ecologist at the Trustees.
Cynthia. Hi, everyone. SHAFI, coastal ecologist with the Trustees. New to this position. I've been here almost a year, but I've worked with the Trustees on Nantucket for the past 5 years. Before that, doing ecological work on Nantucket since 2013. So happy to be here today. And I'm going to continue the conversation on coastal beaches and banks. Next slide, please. So I'm going to breeze through some of the threats and vulnerability, which we've already kind of touched on, and then go into their significance and a bit of their ecology. Next slide. So I've broken down the threats into these 2 different categories, which are related. I mean, they can all be considered human related when we're talking about anthropogenic climate change, but I have a category that's more directly human related, and then one that's more climate related. So some of the human related threats include pollution, that's pretty self-explanatory, increased recreational pressure. So more and more people are using our beaches than ever before in human history. And that's causing some problems with increasing human-wildlife interactions, and also further limiting space available for species that rely on these coastal habitats. Similarly, we've got increased development on our coasts, and that again degrades habitat and shrinks it. And then our climate-related issues, more frequent, more intense storms, we're going to see accelerated rates of erosion, as well as sea level rise, which is going to cause overall decrease in available land. Next slide. So we've seen this image before, but I'm going to show it again just to reiterate the fact that these beaches are dynamic, and they've always been at the mercy of the wind and the waves since the dawn of time. So, and they do change on a daily basis. Again, this is showing history of shoreline change on that same beach, Norton Point and Wasteway. And as you can see, movement and breaches are all part of this beach's natural history. But the concern here is that with climate change, these events are going to become more severe and more frequent, and we're going to see the overall loss of critical habitat, and also the steepening and narrowing of this coast. So, and we're seeing similar patterns to this all over the globe. Next slide. So beaches and banks serve several important functions. One being they buffer against storms and sea level rise. So they are our first and sometimes only line of defense against the ocean. They do things like attenuate wave energy when we have storms and there's storm surge. This photo is from this fall when Tropical Storm Henry hit the Vineyard. They also prevent inland flooding, thus protecting critical habitats and important man-made infrastructure behind these beaches. Next slide. They also provide a sediment source. So sand eroded from beaches or bluffs enters that sediment transport system and then travels to new locations to do things like building beaches elsewhere or moving offshore to create shoals or sandbars. And these are really important cycles. And if that sediment source is cut off through something like hard armoring of a shoreline, then we may start seeing erosion crop up in places that were previously stable or even accreting. So you don't want to mess too much with that. And you really have to weigh your options when considering some of the harder structures. So some of you may recognize this picture if you're from Nantucket. This is the Baxter Road Erosion Control Project on the eastern shore of the island. And so what they did here is they placed these structures called geotubes at the base of the bluff, which are a harder structure to help prevent the erosion. But a really important part of this project is they were required to dump compatible sand over the bluff onto these geotubes to replace the sediment that would have naturally been eroded away from this bluff to sort of contribute to that overall cycle. Next slide. So the sediment transport system I keep referring to is often called Longshore Drift. In its simplest terms, we've got waves that come in at an angle to the beach and that erode sediment away, and that is then picked up by these longshore currents that transport it elsewhere. And you can really see this in action on the north end of Nantucket. This again is an image of the Great Point and Co2 area. Areas in red are eroding, areas in green are accreting or building up. So we know the eastern shore of Nantucket is eroding, and that sand is then carried by these longshore currents northward and actually comes around the tip of Great Point and is then deposited on the western side of Great Point and Co2, actually building the beach. So that whole system is slowly curving westward. Next slide. Something similar is happening on a much bigger scale on Cape Cod. In 2011, the Woods Hole Sea Grant program did a study on sediment transport on the Cape. And so what they found was materials eroded away from key points around the Cape were carried through these longshore currents and were responsible for building structures like Monomoy Island and Monomoy Spit to the south, as well as parts of Provincetown. So these processes are really important and are happening all over the place. Next slide. So we know that beaches and banks are features that serve important physical structures as far as being a barrier or a sediment source, but we really need to recognize them as places that are alive. You know, they support a wide array of wildlife and are in fact ecosystems. And this is a little gray seal pup from the beaches of Nantucket at Great Point. Next slide. So the Cape and Islands are some of the most biodiverse areas in Massachusetts and support a lot of rare and threatened wildlife. And much of that biodiversity is concentrated on or adjacent to the coasts. So here's a map from the Natural Heritage Endangered Species Program. And the areas in yellow are considered priority habitats for rare species. And as you can see, there is a ton of yellow on the Cape and Islands, so very important spots. Additionally, the trustees have determined through our own internal coastal vulnerability assessment that our most valuable habitats in terms of ecosystem functions and the species they support are also our most vulnerable. Next slide. So beaches, they're the interface between the terrestrial environment and the aquatic environment. So when you get different environments coming together, they often form these biodiversity hotspots where lots and lots of species are brought together. And the beach provides important habitat for a whole slew of threatened species, including the roseate tern, the piping plover, least terns, northern harriers, and sea beach knotweed. And you will see my slides are a little bit bird-centric, so I apologize, but that's my forte, so bear with me. And a lot of these species can't survive anywhere else. They need these wide, gently sloping sandy beaches in order to reproduce and thrive. Additionally, beaches provide important stopover habitat for a lot of migratory species, and it gives them a place to stop and rest and refuel as they carry on their arduous migrations. Next slide. So coastal banks support species like bank swallows and belted kingfishers, and these birds actually will burrow into the bluff sometimes as far as 2 or 3 feet inwards. And from there, they'll lay their eggs in these burrows, and it gives them a really sheltered place to raise their chicks. And it's really neat to see them flying in and out of these burrows in the cliffs. It's really fun to watch. Again, we've got things like the claybank tiger beetle, which is a threatened species in Massachusetts, and they actually reside within the bank during their larval stage. And once they reach adulthood, you can see them foraging and hunting on the cliff itself or on adjacent beaches. There's also reports of things like barn owls nesting within the cliffs at Aquina on the Vineyard, which is really cool. And if you think about, where did barn owls nest before there were barns? Well, they would nest on overhangs or cliffs, and they still do sometimes. And truthfully, banks are relatively understudied compared to beaches, probably due to their little bit treacherous nature. So there's likely many, many more species that rely on them, and relationships we aren't even really fully aware of. So with that being said, with the loss of these really important habitats, we'll likely witness the rapid decline of many species. Next slide. So I don't want to be all doom and gloom about this, but I also don't want to downplay the fact that these really remarkable and important habitats are at risk as the climate changes. And so in order to preserve them, it's going to take a lot of creativity and work and dedication and resources, and potentially some of the strategies that Tara mentioned earlier that seek to improve resiliency without sacrificing the ecological integrity of the natural system. So with that, I thank you, and I'll take questions if there's any.
Thanks, Shea. We're actually coming to the very end of our time, so I think we have time for one question before closing remarks, and then we'll follow up over email. But we have a question about what are some of the other important habitats that coastal beaches and banks help to protect?
Sure. So one I'll highlight are salt marshes that usually sit behind a barrier beach or something like that. And they're really the backbone for a lot of aquatic life. They provide really important nursery habitat for lots and lots of fish, shellfish. They, again, help attenuate wave energy when there's storms and just support a lot of life. They're one of the most productive ecosystems on the planet, so they're incredibly important. Additionally, we have things like sandplain grasslands and coastal heathlands that usually sit behind a bank or a beach. You can see something like that on Nantucket, smooth hummocks, or on the Vineyard Wasteway reservation, and they are well-known biodiversity hotspots. They are a habitat that supports tons and tons and tons of rare species and really don't exist in many places in the world. So we're lucky to have a lot of that on the islands, but they're very important.
Thank you so much, Shea and Tara. Great talks today. Again, thank you everyone for joining us. Next week, we have a talk on the Elliott Initiative in Action, new trustees, reservations, and how they come to be. So hopefully you'll join us for that one. I also want to let you know that the third in the series of these State of the Coast presentations is on February 23rd, and that will focus on salt marshes and habitats. So to register or to access recordings, visit thetrustees.org/webinars. And again, everything you heard today would not be possible without our donors. I want to include top supporters like our Founders Circle members in that shout out. Sincerely, thank you. We get a lot of grant work to do these projects, but without the donor funding to supplement that, they wouldn't be possible. So thanks everyone again for joining us, for investing in our mission and believing in a brighter future. And I hope to see you next week.
Thank you.